Good morning. Today we have an interview with Professor Andrea Renda, Senior Research Fellow and Head of Global Governance, Regulation, Innovation and Digital Economy at Center for European Policy Studies. This interview is a part of the Trigger project. More specifically, it's a part of POPE, Permanent Observatory for Public Engagement. The objective of Trigger project is to provide European Union institutions with knowledge and tools to enhance their activeness, effectiveness and influence in global governance, and to develop new ways to harness the potential of public engagement and participatory foresight in complex governance decisions. While POP is a part of Trigger project, and it's a permanent observatory for public engagement, which provides the observation of effective public engagement tools and methods and publishes quarterly newsletters dedicated to the topical themes. The first newsletter is published in July 2019 and focuses on sustainability issues. Today, the interview with Andrea Renda will focus on the Trigger project and to what extent and how it will cope with the 5 important challenges which we identified. The first challenge is global geopolitical game and European Union activeness. So United States, China, and Russia are hard diplomatic and military power actors, while European Union is a soft power. All member states together are still the largest market in the world, but European Union institutions grew around the single internal market, and only recently, since 8 years, the European Union is presented as one representative for foreign affairs, the EEAC. However, it's representing only the positions mediated across 28 and 27 after Brexit national diplomatic powers. And this makes it less authoritative than member states' diplomacies and military powers. So the first question, Andrea, with these historical circumstances, how could European Union scale up its activeness in the geopolitical game? Would the soft power and support to multilateral governance institutions be enough for the European Union to play a significant role?
Hello, Svetlana. Thanks for the question. The issue is complicated because the EU is certainly a soft power. The EU certainly is highly trusted in a set of institutions around the world. But the EU doesn't always speak in the same way and with the same voice, depending on the sector. So there are sectors in which the EU is represented by a single EU institution in global negotiations. And that's the example, for example, of the climate negotiations, the example of very often the internet governance negotiations and many others. Where there are other fields in which the EU goes in much more sparse way, and it's typically United Nations negotiations, for example, where some of the countries that are members of the European Union are represented individually, even in the Security Council, and whereas in other parts of the global governance debate, there is a mixture of the two. So the EU and the member states go together, sometimes in a consistent way, sometimes not. The EU is also not necessarily always a soft power, because there are certain things that the EU does that have a very strong extraterritorial impact. Think about the General Data Protection Regulation, where the EU is really proactively trying to set rules for anyone around the world that wants to deal with the EU single market. So the EU is a soft power, but also a normative, a norm leader, if you wish, and an important actor and a very trusted actor in setting the rules. So in Trigger, we will explore the way in which the EU shapes global governance in a number of fields. Some of these fields are more technology related. We have a dedicated work package for technologies such as AI or blockchain, and more generally in internet governance and cyber law. But we also look at other fields, and in particular in what we call the deep dives. So we'll look at climate, at the sustainable development goals, and we will look at migration to see in what cases different configurations of EU governance, different degrees of integration at the EU level or multi-level governance, so allocation of responsibilities between the EU and the member states, change the influence that the EU can exert. So the strength and the effectiveness of the EU when dealing with the rest of the world in governance negotiations. So The External Action Service has been a very important addition to what the EU can do, but it's only one tiny piece in what the EU does in trade negotiations, in global governance settings, in dealing with private regulators around the world, and also in other specific fields in which the EU is nudging the international community towards specific ideals and specific values. People might say that, many commentators have said that the high-level representative is, so the one in charge of the External Action Service, is not strong enough, or is not powerful enough, or only deals with things until they become important enough that then they are taken up by the political leaders. But I think still it performs a very important coordinating role. Now, keep an eye in the future, and we do in Trigger keep an eye on this, on the potential strengthening of the EU in specific sectors. I would only mention two very neighboring sectors. One is the enhanced cooperation in security and defense, the so-called PESCO, and more generally the strengthening of the EU investments in research and innovation, and also EU policy coordination more generally in defense. Because this, of course, adds to what the EU shows to the rest of the world in terms of being strategically autonomous and able to deal with also hard sectors when it comes to global governance, such as defense.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrea. Very interesting. We mentioned here already the part of technology. So actually, our second question is connected with this. As a challenge, we identify economic, financial, and technological development, and the inequality challenge. At least from the perspective of Western societies, growth is increasingly jobless and polarizing, with an increasing divide between the few gaining increasing share of profits and the many experiencing shrinking wages, precarious jobs, and unemployment. In terms of technology, do you think it is possible to drive transformative technologies such as artificial intelligence, blockchain, distributed ledgers toward better and more equitable outcomes? Do you think that responsible competitiveness and innovation be a paradigm the European Union can contribute to foster, promoting within Europe and outside a model of inclusive and sustainable development? And in this case, Andrea, what do you think? Which roles can have new global governance regulations and multi-stakeholder initiatives, and how the European Union could play a role in this?
Well, that's a very important part of the work that Trigger will do, and we see lots of developments currently. With one initial statement that I'd like to make, which is we live in a time of breathtaking technological acceleration and technological innovation, right? Yes, but the evolution of digital technologies currently and led us into a society that is an evolution of markets that is not necessarily sustainable, right? We see rising inequality in especially those countries that have led these huge digital platforms develop. And the United States, the crisis of the Silicon Valley model, the rising inequality, the increased debate in academia and in policy making on the fact that the creation of value is increasingly distant from the extraction of value. So the ones that reap the profits on activities are not the users, are not the farmers, are not the industrial companies, but are rather the platforms that convert user attention into online advertising revenues, for example, or that are able to reorganize in a way that really extracts most of the value that is created by the other players in the ecosystem. So once we say this, when we look at the emerging new technologies such as AI or blockchain, the issue is really, are we able to foster their development in a way that is not necessarily immediately most profitable, but it's more sustainable in the medium term? And the answer that has been given at the EU level and also in other parts of the world is that, in particular on AI, the development has to be human-centric and has to be conditioned and constrained by the superior goal of achieving sustainable development. Meaning, we're not asking the question, how do we make robots happy? How do we, there's a friend of mine that passed by. How do we make robots happy?
Hope he's not a robot.
He's not a robot. How do we make robots happy? How do we maximize the number of robots in the factories and the plants? We're asking ourselves, how is AI and its neighboring technologies going to help us achieve goals such as full and decent employment for everybody, or greater human capital, or lower inequality. And this requires a human-centric and a planet-centric approach to technology, which is completely different from the one that the US and China are currently adopting. Now, what is the EU doing in this respect? I am personally a member of the European Commission's high-level expert group on artificial intelligence. We've been working in the direction of shaping rules that are sustainable, in the sense of allowing AI that is trustworthy and that is functional to creating a harmonious and sustainable vision of society and the environment over the medium to long term. So AI as, so asking ourselves what AI can do for Europe rather than what can Europe do for AI. We don't care about AI. We care about what AI can do for us and to help us achieve a sustainable and prosperous economy and society by 2030, which is the current agenda that we have, or we are about to have at the European Union level. Now, what can the EU do further for this? Well, the EU, and with this high-level group and the work of the European Commission and the work of some of the member states, has shown a very good example so far in setting these ethical rules, the so-called ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI.
Yes.
What it has done for the purposes of Trigger and its multi-level governance emphasis, it has done something very interesting, the creation of a coordinated plan between the EU and the member states that really ensures the convergence of the action of the EU and the member states to maximize impact at the international level. And now the EU has to make a decision, and we'll see that as a natural experiment. France and Canada, within the G7, have proposed the creation of an intergovernmental panel on artificial intelligence that would try to focus on AI for good, rather than what the US and China are currently obsessed with, which is a turf war, a digital arms race, in particular on the cybersecurity and defense side. So the EU really has a chance to focus much more on the applications of AI that are important for the economy and society and the environment, rather than fighting with the neighbors, okay? And I think it's a unique opportunity. The EU now has to decide whether to fully endorse and support this proposal. The IPAI, the Intergovernmental Panel on AI, is modeled on the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the proposal will be tabled in the next G7 meeting in Biarritz in August. And we'll see what happens. But I think this is of what the good things that the EU has done so far in terms of actorness now require some concrete action at the international level. There's a chance there. It's on the table. Let's see if the Commission wants to reap that opportunity or not.
Yeah, these are definitely very positive and very optimistic steps. We look through this document, which you developed also in our newsletter in Pope Observatory. So yeah, we have a summary of it in the document. But there is also another document which was recently published, and it's a reflection paper published in January 2019 on how European Union can realize the United Nations agenda on sustainable development goals in Europe. So that's actually our next challenge, Europe and the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. In this paper, they presented three scenarios of, it's a foresight study, three scenarios on how it will be developed. First one, an overarching European Union Sustainable Development Goals strategy to guide the action of the European Union and its member states, and it would be a strong European Union actorness. The second scenario is continued mainstreaming of the Sustainable Development Goals and in all relevant EU policies by Commission, but not enforcing member states' action, which would be soft and inner-looking European Union actorness. And the third scenario is putting enhanced focus on external actions while consolidating current sustainability ambition at European Union level, which is soft and outer-looking European Union actorness. So our question, Andrea, is to what extent and how the Trigger project can and will contribute to this foresight exercise?
The Trigger project is very much about sustainable development goals. Not only we have an overall focus on how the EU can bring forward its values and ideals, which are very much close to sustainable development around the world and influence the global governance agenda in this respect. But we also have one of our deep dives, which start in December 2019, that will really look at how the EU has managed, or whether the EU has managed to really build prominence, so what we call actorness, and exert an influence, so be effective in fostering its own agenda within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. I do believe that like very often happens when you have three scenarios that are of different levels of ambitions, a different level of attribution of responsibilities between the EU and the member states, different levels of emphasis between internal and external. The real one that will win eventually is scenario 4, meaning we need a scenario that is not written yet, which couples strength and cohesion in achieving the Sustainable Development Agenda at home, which means many things. It means not only reaffirming the centrality of sustainable development. We're not sure. It depends very much on the new president of the Commission. We saw Frans Timmermans being a very, very possible candidate until the very last minute. When Frans Timmermans visited us at SAPS in February this year, he said, if I become the Commission's president, my first responsibility will be to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. But since he's not the president designated for the candidate that will be heard next week by the Parliament, and the candidate is Ursula von der Leyen, it remains to be seen what's the level of commitment on that side, or whether the EU really wants to go and wants to live up to the expectations and what it has stated so far, which is that the Agenda 2030, so the overarching agenda of the European Commission and the EU in general for the next decade, will be about Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this would require many things if you want to take it seriously. Not only that, as the Commission has already stated, that Sustainable Development Goals be mainstreamed into each and every aspect of EU policy, which means in the semester, in the budget, in the better regulation agenda, in the industrial policy agenda, and so on and so forth. And we know that this is somehow happening, but very timidly. We know that, for example, DG GROW in the European Commission is working on a new industrial policy communication that is oriented towards SDGs. The debate on the next multi-annual financial framework, 2021-2027, has been partly, at least, influenced by the need to achieve Sustainable Development Goals. This could have happened in a fuller way, but it has happened to some extent, so that's encouraging. But not only that, it also requires that each and every member state develops an own sustainable development agenda with own indicators and targets, and tries to develop rules and reforms in a way that help those countries achieve the frontier that they've given themselves in the achievement of the sustainable development goals. So it is a big effort, and it should take in principle the whole 2020 to go through this. There's a need for a lot of political commitment to get there. Now, this is the first pillar. You need to do that if you want to be anywhere close to credible in the global level, because it's very difficult to be credible and even have a sufficient level of actorness at the global level if you're not practicing what you preach at home, right? If you really talk the talk, but you don't walk the walk, as people in the US typically say. So once the walk has been walked, at the internal level, the EU will be much more credible in fostering the agenda through its role as an external actor, as a global actor. The EU already has, since 2016, adopted a communication on the EU as a global actor, in which it focuses its future external action on SDGs, SDG-centric, which means in trade negotiations, and in global governance negotiations, in its assistance to neighboring countries, in its assistance to the wider Europe program, and so on and so forth. The EU will use the SDGs and the orientation towards the SDGs as a condition, as a conditionality for engaging with the rest of the world. And for example, the very recent trade agreement between the EU and Mercosur contains an interesting clause that if Brazil, because of Jair Bolsonaro as a new president, decides to pull out of the Paris Agreement, the EU pulls out of the Mercosur Agreement.
Okay.
Which means the EU really makes commitment towards environmental targets as a strict conditionality that dictates the EU's involvement with those countries. Otherwise, forget about EU, forget about the single market, forget about the opportunities that engaging with us can offer.
Okay. Thank you, Andrea. And if we do step back and think again about public engagement, the next challenge is actually very, very topical and important for me as well, because while working on this newsletter of POPE, of our permanent observatory for public engagement, it came to my mind definitely internet is increasingly showing a dark side by fragmenting the public discourse. Anyone can present a certain view and attract a like-minded audience, resulting in a balkanization of perspectives that can be easily exploited by populist ideologies, scaling ignorance and fakefulness on the World Wide Web. And it means that entails opinions formed out of fake news instead of factual evidence, and increasingly complicated policy implementation, as the old technocratic and top-down approaches are no more easy to legitimate against the public. So, Andrea, the question is if Trigger will focus on public engagement and new ways for enabling more collaborative models of democracy, citizens' engagement, and public discourses, designing new tools for this purpose. How can we address this challenge? Can you describe briefly the ambition and approach of Trigger in this respect?
Yeah, there is a problem currently, as you correctly point out, and the level of trust of people and the internet. But traditionally, the level of trust, in particular in the digital giants, or what we call the large online intermediaries, or in some countries are called the GAFAs or the FANGs, depending on the country where you go. This level was traditionally of trust was traditionally very high. In the past months, in the past year, if you wish, from a level of trust in large online intermediaries, very close to 70%. We've gone down to less than 40% of the internet users have trust in companies like Facebook or Google or Amazon altogether. That is a clear sign that scandals such as Cambridge Analytica and many others have really deteriorated and eroded the level of trust in these intermediaries. Now, this also inevitably affects the quality of the public debate, the trust that citizens put in engaging with social media, for example, and forming their political opinions through social media, and more generally, the level of trust in cyberspace, meaning in an environment that provides enormous opportunities, of course, but at the same time contains a dark side, which is pretty big. I mean, you consider that the estimated percentage of the internet that the most powerful search engine that we have, which is Google search, can actually map and crawl on the total of the internet and the content that we have over the internet, it doesn't go above 12%. So there's an 88% of the internet that even Google cannot see. And we call it the deep web, the dark web. And so many things happen there. And that it gives vertigo to an end user to know that the data, for example, that they share on the internet will be lost somewhere. And there will be a loss of control of what is done with their data. And also whether the messages that they receive from the online intermediaries, from the application providers that work on the internet might be real or fake. Now, in this respect, current technological evolution is even more disturbing because we are now in the age of so-called deep fakes. The so-called deep fakes use advanced AI systems to really replicate perfectly the appearance of public figures, but cloning them in a way that then can enable the hackers to do this, to make them say completely different things compared to what they think. So this can create, opportunities for manipulating public opinion, escalation of tensions that might lead to wars. There's a lot of work being done in academia and in policy fora as to how to counter deepfakes. And there seems to be little alternative compared to, using than to use AI, advanced AI to counter deepfakes, but at the same time work in the direction of strengthening the trustworthiness of technologies by enhancing the responsibilities of the players that work on the internet to check what is passing through their servers and the pipelines. Now, this is a Camelot moment, if you wish. This is a sea change because only 20 years ago when the internet started, we were supporting a non-regulatory approach or a very light regulatory approach for the internet that shielded the online intermediaries from responsibility. And today we are working on how to make those players more responsible because they are the ones that can observe, at least to some extent, what happens in between the enormous amount of information that is on the internet and the users. So what is Trigger doing in this respect? A number of exciting things. Quite cool, I would say. First of all, in Cocteau, we work on enhanced ways to, Cocteau is one of the key software tools that we develop in Trigger. Cocteau means co-creating the European Union. It focuses on specific governance decisions and it involves large audiences in an interactive way, trying to mobilize end users and their creativity and their perception and their ability to provide information in order to build a good, trusted knowledge base for taking governance decisions in the future. So that's one thing. The second thing, within our deep dives and within our experimental phases of Trigger, we are working on testing with end users, more specifically, how a different internet could look like and how would end users behave. So the idea is to imagine a world and an internet in which control of the data is given back to the end users. We're not the first ones to imagine this. If you Defense, for example, Aalto University in particular is working since many years on this project called My Data that does exactly the same thing. But even Tim Berners-Lee, one of the pioneers and the funders of the internet, has been working for a few years now on a project called Solid that is actually aimed at changing the architecture of the internet and the user interaction with the internet in a way that gives a lot more control to the end user. So we want to imagine, we don't want to let the end users decide how this new internet would work. We want to imagine a new way of doing things on the internet, and we want to co-create at the margin using what we sometimes call the IKEA effect, meaning the fact that people have more ownership on things when they co-design them or they assemble them, in the case of IKEA. In this case, what we want to do is to ask end users to help us fill the canvas, meaning tell us, under this new scenario, what would you do with the internet? How would you behave? Would you find your way in the same with the same ease through the internet pages? Would you have a higher level of trust? So we want to engage with the end users to find new ideas and new ways to propose an alternative design for the internet. So see, that is a very ambitious step that we take in Trigger. It is part of a very specific type of governance decisions, and it also connects to what the EU could then do at a global level in order to affect a different set of global governance decisions. Once we know that something is feasible and would be welcomed by the end users, it would enhance the level of trust, then it would be up to the EU institutions to voice this and to bring these ideas to the global governance debates in places like the Internet Governance Forum, the G20, the G7, and so on, to trigger a new way of interacting with online interface for the end users.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. And then we have actually a last challenge we have identified, probably one of the most difficult challenging ones and very crucial one. It's demographic challenge and regional interaction with the Mediterranean, Western Balkans, South Mediterranean countries, and Sub-Sahara Africa. In the beginning of 20th century, 1 out of 4 inhabitants of the planet were Europeans. And in 2050, according to United Nations projections, there will be 1 European out of 14 world inhabitants. So this is almost a fact, as demographic projections are the more stable and predictable events, and to know it should change the mind of all Europeans. How is it possible to keep high standards of living, affluence, and global influence for shrinking and an aging population if Europe will continue to close itself into a fortress? Especially because the most of the new inhabitants in the coming decades will be born in Africa, a neighborhood continent. Co-development, a regional integration of Europe, the Mediterranean and Africa, regional value change, and better regulation of migration flows to enable a greater circulation of human capital and brains in the region, inclusive investment and finance. These are all the factors that should be combined in inclusive and sustainable scenario implementation strategy tailored to the Euro-Africa region. Andrea, what do you think, to what extent Trigger will focus on this regional challenge and contribute to bring it to the fore of European strategies making in public discourse?
Now, this is perhaps the most delicate part of Trigger, because in Trigger, we have recently decided that one of our 4 deep dives, so the big sector-specific, say, explorations that we will do in terms of research, but also in terms of data science, will be migration. Now, this means that Trigger will look at how the specific way in which the EU has participated in the global debate on migration has affected its effectiveness and actorness in the first place. I'll just give you one example. The recent UN Global Compact on Migration is something that has been negotiated at the EU level, but then it had to be ratified at the member state level, and there's been a lot of different reactions in the individual member states on the Global Compact on Migration. Countries like my own original country, Italy, have had their own problems, and even a split within the government coalition in deciding whether the UN Global Compact on Migration should be ratified or not. So there's different levels of endorsement, and there's a very weak overall image of Europe when negotiating and when expressing its voice in a compact way at the global level on migration. Now, the other thing that is important is that in Trigger we have partners, we have a network of economists from the Southern Mediterranean, and we will do with them an exercise in understanding how the overall governance of migration has been orchestrated and has been designed from the EU level, and also in the dialogue with those countries. As we know, of course, that there has been a moment of crisis, where there's been a decade of crisis, or almost now, on in terms of migrations and the crossing of the Mediterranean. There are no stable and long-standing solutions currently on the table. There are a few ideas as to how to improve cooperation. There's a new Africa partnership that potentially could contribute to this, but there are other risks that might trigger even more migration in the future. You can only imagine the fact that a recent academic paper has highlighted the fact that the melting of the Arctic ice is creating a lack of precipitations in West Africa, and this is leading to more dry land and the need for many more people to migrate towards the north. Meaning, it's not just fixing the problems in the flows of migrants throughout the Mediterranean, but also creating the preconditions in social and environmental terms for a stable and a sustainable migration flow from Africa to the EU that will be essential in the future. I'm not sure Trigger will be able to solve all these problems. What is certain is that we will provide the tools to potentially co-create problems, co-create decisions, and co-create solutions to some of these emerging problems by testing the acceptability of specific patterns or specific new policies with civil society, so with larger audiences. So providing the European Commission with tools to pre-test and experiment with solutions that will be considered more or less sustainable depending on the reaction of the end users. It's going to be very complicated in this case, but I think we can provide some tools. Now, that said, as a footnote to what you were saying before, Europe today already represents something like 6% of the global population, as you were saying. It's not a major part. I mean, most of the explosion of demography in Africa and in Southeast Asia present enormous challenges also for Europe, but also opportunities. We are an aging society, some member states more than others, in particular Western Europe, as a demography that is now looking like an inverted pyramid. And we will need to rebalance that pyramid, not necessarily only by importing people, but also by importing and educating people and integrating people within our civil society. That is an enormous challenge. It has to be done at the pan-European level, because it cannot be done individually by member states. Otherwise, you end up with these turf wars. How many quotas of migrants are you going to get, and which ones you want? It easily faces, especially if done at the member state level, the resistance of populist movements. Even if done at the pan-European level, it will face the resistance from populist movements, because the incumbent citizens, including the incumbent migrants, sometimes, as we saw in the US with the Trump administration, sometimes are against additional flows of people into our countries. So I think not only in terms of evidence-based policies, but also in terms of communication and narrative, this is something that will have to be dealt with in a completely different way in the next years in order to ensure not only that Europe preserves its actorness and its vocation towards the global good, but also that Europe does its own interest in bringing in the people that we need in order to rebalance our demographics and to increase our diversity. And don't forget, diversity has empirically proven to strengthen innovation, to strengthen the richness of our cultures, and it is not something we should fear. It's something that we should handle with care, as we normally say, but we shouldn't handle with fear.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you so much for very interesting insights and very relevant ones. It was very important, I think, to have this conversation and to, even for me myself, to have these opinions on these main challenges. And yeah, thank you. If you have some closing words, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for your interviews, Svetlana. I hope this is the first of many interviews, and then your Pope will be a thriving one. And I say to anyone who will listen to this interview, watch out for Trigger results and go to the Trigger website, because we're going to post exciting things over the coming weeks and months. So, and thanks to everybody.
Thank you.